At 00:30 on 23rd of January 1991, 8 men of B Squadron 22 Special Air Service climbed out of an RAF Chinook into the winter dark of western Iraq. Their call sign was Bravo 20. Commanding them was Sergeant Andy McNab, a pseudonym for a soldier born Stephen Billy Mitchell, who had joined the army at 16 with the reading age of an 11-year-old. Their mission, as published in McNab's own account, was to work the main supply route between Baghdad and northwest Iraq, find and destroy mobile Scud launchers, and sever the underground fibre-optic cable that carried Iraqi military communications. The stakes were strategic. The coalition air campaign had opened on 17th of January 1991. And mobile Iraqi Scud launchers were still striking Israel and Saudi Arabia. The western Iraqi desert needed policing, and the SAS put roughly 60 men inside it. 2 half-squadrons split into patrols with call signs like Bravo 10, Bravo 30, and the one that would become a publishing industry, Bravo 20. The Chinook that night carried a second 8-man patrol, Bravo 30, which stepped off the aircraft with 2 open-topped Land Rovers. Bravo 20 walked away from the landing zone on foot. They walked into flat, featureless desert carrying Bergens. Roughly 40 hours after insertion, at about 1600 on 24th of January, they were compromised. When it was over, 3 of the 8 were dead. 1 was killed in action, 2 died of hypothermia. 4, including McNab, were prisoners of Iraq. 1 man walked to the Syrian border. 8 went in. 1 came out on his own feet. That skeleton supports every published account of the patrol. What the comment sections fight about is who carries the blame. Scroll to the bottom of any documentary about Bravo 20, and the same argument is waiting. The most engaged comment under the video claims the patrol was doomed before it arrived. Only short wheelbase Land Rovers were available, too small for the job, so 8 men went into Iraq on foot. That comment drew 214 engagements, 98 likes and 58 replies. The number makes it look settled. It measures interest, not accuracy. And the claim itself is one truncated, disputed account, cut off from the mission record it claims to describe. The most liked accusation on the video is blunter. The one that got away pretty much showed McNab's incompetence. 65 engagements, 18 replies. And underneath it, the defense that appears every single time. An incompetent soldier does not pass SAS selection, and the army does not appoint one to command an 8-man patrol behind enemy lines. Neither comment proves anything beyond what its author already believes. The accusation is a verdict without a mechanism. The defense is a credential doing the work of evidence. McNab's leadership can't be judged by either shortcut. It has to be audited decision by decision, against the equipment, the planning, the communications, and the command failures that surrounded him. An audit of 50 comments drawn from the thread shows a telling pattern, although the platform's own metadata can't agree on whether 195 or 304 comments exist in total, and the available view of the thread is only a truncated preview. Everything concluded from that sample stays provisional. Even so, the largest category of engagement, 315 interactions across 12 comments, was people adding to or correcting the story. The second, 242 across 12, was people arguing over which account to trust. Whatever else the thread demonstrates, it demonstrates demand. Viewers want the versions tested against each other. So that is what this does. Accusation by accusation, against the documented record of what the patrol carried, what it was told, and what it faced. Start with the vehicle claim, because it's the most popular explanation and the least supported one. The accusation runs: the patrol was offered only short wheelbase Land Rovers, which were too small for the mission. So the men went to war on foot. It surfaces across the internet, in encyclopedia summaries, in Reddit threads, in the comment under the video. The detail that keeps it alive is plausible. A static observation post needs men, radios, explosives, rations. A short wheelbase vehicle genuinely can't carry 8 men and their war kit. If that was all that existed, the decision to walk was forced. The problem is that the SAS in the Gulf War was built around long wheelbase Land Rovers. The desert patrol vehicle adopted by the regiment's mobility troop in 1985 was the Land Rover 110, the long wheelbase Pinky, and in 1991 the squadrons were transitioning from the pink camouflaged 109 to sand-coloured 110s. The fighting columns that crossed into Iraq operated with a Unimog truck as a mother vehicle and between 8 and 12 heavily armed 110s per column, mounting 50 caliber Brownings, general-purpose machine guns, Mark 19 grenade launchers and Milan anti-tank missiles. A and D squadrons each deployed roughly 8 110s in their half-squadron columns. The long wheelbase vehicle wasn't a rumour or an aspiration. It was the regiment's primary desert platform in operational use. And the proof sits closer than any theatre-level inventory. The same RAF Chinook that inserted Bravo 20 on the night of 22nd January carried Bravo 30, which brought 2 open-topped Land Rovers, described as old and unreliable, and those vehicles probably saved their lives. One patrol commander in the same squadron on the same night took long wheelbase vehicles into the same desert. Bravo 20 didn't. So the bald claim that suitable vehicles were unavailable in theatre is inaccurate. That matters because of who says the patrol chose otherwise. Brigadier Andy McNab commanded Special Forces in the Gulf. In the BBC documentary series The Gulf War, McNab made the point publicly. The failure to go behind enemy lines with vehicles was a tactical error, and it was the patrol's own choice. His exact framing: the men of Bravo 20 themselves chose not to use vehicles, while other patrols with the same task, finding Scud missiles, made what proved to be the right decision and took Land Rovers. One account says McNab went further and rejected advice from superiors to leave vehicles at an emergency pickup point for exfiltration. Another says the decision was joint. The patrol felt they were too few and the available vehicles too small for a fixed observation post mission. Those two versions aren't the same thing, and the public record does not let us choose between them with confidence. But the senior commander's judgment is contemporaneous, on the record, and pointed. The choice to go without transport was the patrol's own. The consequence was mechanical and brutal. Without wheels, a compromised patrol can't break contact. Other SAS teams on the same Scud task, when they had to abort, could abandon vehicles and exfiltrate. Bravo 20 had to outrun the Iraqi security net on foot from deep behind enemy lines in a January desert. That context makes the detail of the first night sting harder. McNab's account has the patrol marching 20 kilometres from the landing zone to their hiding place. Ryan and Coburn put the distance at 2 kilometres. Michael Asher, the former SAS soldier and desert explorer who retraced the route in 2000 for a Channel 4 investigation, concluded that eyewitness Bedouin testimony and the terrain itself support the shorter figure. The reason the patrol spent the night shuttling rather than marching was the weight. 4 men would walk roughly 300 metres, drop their Bergens, and wait. The next 4 would move up and drop theirs. Then the first 4 would go back for the jerry cans of water. Every man covered 3 times the ground distance just to get the kit into position. Asher's reconstruction of the march distance is now broadly accepted, and it changes the shape of the story. The patrol didn't march deep into the desert and get unlucky. It moved barely 2 kilometers in its first night, then was found. One thing the vehicle debate can't do is prove the outcome would have been different. The compromise was triggered by local human presence, a bulldozer driver, shepherds, villagers, not by the mode of transport. A Land Rover wouldn't have made 8 men invisible. What it would have given them was speed, and speed is the one asset an escaping patrol can't do without. The counterfactual is speculation. The decision itself isn't, and the harshest criticism of it comes from the man commanding all special forces in theatre, who called it an error while the war was still being digested. The second accusation follows from the first. Even on foot, the patrol needed to talk, and its radios failed, and the commander again carries the blame. The popular version of this claim sometimes goes further, that the patrol went into Iraq without radios or spare batteries. That is wrong. The signaller, Stephen Legs Lane, carried a PRC 319 high-frequency patrol radio. 4 men, including McNab, carried TACB emergency beacons for talking to aircraft. Coburn carried a Magellan GPS receiver. McGowan carried the Kite night sight. The Bergens contained spare batteries for the radio, 7 days of rations, demolition kit, PE4 plastic explosive, detonators, both Claymore and LC anti-personnel mines, and intravenous drips and fluids for emergencies. It wasn't a patrol stripped of communications equipment. It was a patrol whose communications failed. The dispute is over why. McNab's account says the patrol was issued incorrect radio frequencies. The counter-evidence arrived in 2002, when a BBC investigation examined the SAS daily logs kept during the war and found that Bravo 20's transmissions had been received and recorded at headquarters. If the frequencies had been wrong, the transmissions wouldn't have arrived. The logs show the patrol could transmit. The failure was in receiving. Peter Ratcliffe, Regimental Sergeant Major of 22 SAS during the Gulf War, drew the sharp conclusion. As patrol commander, McNab had a duty to ensure the patrol's radios, frequencies, and communications equipment were correct and serviceable. Ratcliffe's position is unambiguous, and it puts the frequency check, a pre-mission administrative task, squarely inside McNab's lane. But the system's lane is wider than the commander's. The PRC 319 was an HF set that needed a long static wire antenna for reliable communication, a hard thing to deploy while moving at night under contact, and the patrol had barely stopped moving before it was compromised. The TACB beacons were one way and needed clear line of sight to an aircraft. The Iraqi winter sky didn't reliably supply it. And headquarters doctrine was built around radio silence. Routine check-ins were avoided to deny the enemy signals intelligence. Loss of contact wasn't treated as an emergency trigger. Ryan's junior account described the protocol in bleakly simple terms. If the patrol had not come on the air within 48 hours of being dropped off, a helicopter would come looking. A communications culture designed for a Cold War battlefield met a patrol that needed urgent help, and the result was silence on both ends. The dramatic irony is documented. While the patrol tried to raise Allied jets overhead, a US pilot heard them. The pilots knew the patrol's situation. They couldn't reply. Sorties were flown to the team's last known position and expected route. But the SAS daily log recorded a TACB contact on 24th of January and assumed the patrol was moving south. The patrol was moving northwest towards Syria. Coburn's later account insists Syria had been agreed during planning on the advice of the officer commanding B Squadron. Ratcliffe says the uncommunicated change of plan nullified the rescue effort. Then there is the exfiltration plan itself. British Standard Operating Procedure. If communication fails or an emergency occurs, return to the original infiltration point, where a helicopter will land briefly every 24 hours. Bravo 20 aborted the mission and moved to the pickup point. The helicopter never arrived. The pilot had fallen ill en route, aborted, and no backup was triggered. The entire emergency extraction of an 8-man patrol behind enemy lines rested on a single aircraft and a single pilot. The intelligence the patrol was handed was a separate failure. Ryan's account of the briefing is 3 words. The intelligence was rubbish. The Guardian's 2002 reporting put it more precisely. Faulty intelligence meant the 8-man patrol was dropped in the middle of 3,000 Iraqi troops. The Imperial War Museum's memorial plaque, the nearest thing to an official commemorative record, states that from the outset the mission was compromised by enemy troops and civilians in the landing zone. None of this erases Ratcliffe's point. A commander checks his frequencies, but the weight of the evidence points away from a single failure and toward a stack of them. One man's pre-mission checklist, a radio architecture that needed a static antenna the mission couldn't use, a one-way beacon that needed sky the weather wouldn't give, a doctrine that mistook silence for success, an exfiltration plan with no redundancy, and an intelligence product that put 8 men on top of a division. Then the radio debate meets the ground, and the ground is worse than the doctrine. Around 1600 on 24th January came the compromise. The accounts diverge on how. McNab describes a young shepherd, then what the patrol thought was a tank, actually a bulldozer, then a firefight with Iraqi armoured personnel carriers and soldiers. Asher interviewed the Bedouin family who found the patrol, and their version has no soldiers at all. A bulldozer driver spotted the men. Warning shots were fired, the patrol returned fire and moved away. Coburn's Soldier 5 partially supports McNab's version. 1 armoured personnel carrier, fire from a 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun, and numerous Iraqi soldiers. Ryan wrote that McGowan saw an armoured car carrying a .50 caliber machine gun. Somehow, I never saw that. Whatever the trigger, the patrol believed itself compromised and withdrew, leaving excess equipment on the ground. That night, while McNab tried to contact a passing coalition aircraft with a TACB, the patrol split in 2. Phillips, Ryan and McGowan kept moving through the darkness. The other 5, McNab, Pring, Lane, Consiglio and Coburn, waited for a response that never came. Neither group followed the emergency rendezvous procedure they had been trained to use and had followed the night before. Both headed independently for the Syrian border. The split divided more than the men. It divided the kit. The 3-man group had 2 M16 M203 assault rifles, a Browning high-power pistol, at least 1 TACB, and the night sight hanging around Ryan's neck. The 5-man group had 3 Minimes and 2 M16 M203s, plus McGowan's Minimi, which McNab carried briefly, then discarded. They also had the Magellan GPS. What neither group had enough of was warmth, and the western Iraq winter was about to cash that in. Vince Phillips, the 36-year-old second-in-command, was already failing. A 19-year veteran of the British Armed Forces and an 8-year veteran of the SAS, Phillips had begun to suffer from hypothermia. On the evening of 25th January, he could no longer hold his M16 M203 and handed it to McGowan. As the 3 men pushed north, his condition worsened until he mistook his black gloves for the colour of his own hands and began yelling out loud. Around 2,000 hours, he lost contact with the other two entirely. Ryan and McGowan both said they searched for 20 minutes before deciding to continue. Phillips died alone in the open desert, 2 days after the patrol had been inserted. The three-man group lasted another day. At about midday on 26th of January, Ryan and McGowan were stumbled upon by an elderly goat herder. After discussion about killing the man, McGowan decided to go with him to find a vehicle, leaving his belt kit behind so he didn't cut such an aggressive figure. Ryan judged it unsafe and stayed, on the agreement that McGowan would return by 1830 hours. McGowan walked 4 hours with the herder and walked into a group of men with a Toyota Land Cruiser. The versions of what happened next differ. Ryan says McGowan shot an unarmed man and 2 men with AK-47s. McGowan's own 2002 interview describes a single shot at a soldier sprinting for a vehicle, then a click on empty. Phillips had never reloaded the weapon after the initial contact. McGowan was captured. Ryan, now alone, began the walk that made him famous. The distance to Syria is itself a contested number. Roughly 180 miles in most British accounts, nearly 300 kilometres in others, more than 120 kilometres on the Imperial War Museum's plaque. Whatever the true figure, he crossed the border after 8 days and nights. The claim that it was the longest escape and evasion in SAS history has been repeated often enough to become conventional, though no official record book exists to certify it. The 5-man group had its own catastrophe. On the evening of 26 January, they commandeered a taxi by having Concilio pretend to be wounded in McNab's arms at the roadside. When the car stopped, Pring, Lane and Coburn closed in from cover. McNab's account has the group shooting their way through a checkpoint, killing 3 soldiers. Ryan's second-hand account, presumably drawn from the regimental debrief, says one of the Iraqi occupants drove them to a police checkpoint. They slipped out, hoping to rendezvous on the far side, and the driver alerted the police. Asher tracked down the actual driver of the car. His account supported Ryan's. No armed contact, no Iraqi casualties. In the early hours of 27th January, the group came into contact with local civilians and police. An Iraqi policeman who was there told Asher that 30 armed Iraqis, police and civilians mixed, attacked the SAS team, and that contrary to McNab's account, the SAS opened fire first. Concilio was shot and killed by armed civilians at approximately 0200 hours. Lane, suffering from hypothermia, swam the Euphrates with Pring and died of cold on the far bank. Pring, McNab and the wounded Coburn were captured. Coburn had been shot in both the arm and the ankle. The 4 prisoners, McNab, Pring, McGowan and Coburn, were moved between locations and interrogated. They had rehearsed a cover story, a combat search and rescue team stranded after an emergency landing. McNab's book describes teeth extraction and burning with a heated spoon. McGowan, captured alongside him, said those specific incidents didn't happen and called it inconceivable that such things could occur without being discussed or physically obvious. News footage of McGowan and Pring at their release on 5 March 1991 showed no facial injuries, and a Red Cross representative described them as in good shape. They were last held at Abu Ghraib prison, a name that would mean something very different 12 years later. That is the factual skeleton of the tragedy. The blame war happens above it, in the books, and the books don't agree. There are now 5 published versions of Bravo 20. McNab's Bravo 20 appeared in 1993. Ryan's The One That Got Away followed in 1995. Ratcliffe's Eye of the Storm came in 2000. Asher's investigative The Real Bravo 20 landed in 2002. The same year the BBC's Panorama examined the official logs. and Coburn published Soldier 5 in 2004. The books agree on the skeleton: 8 men, a Chinook, a Scud mission, compromise, 3 dead, 4 captured, 1 escapee, and diverge on almost everything that makes the story dramatic. The escapee himself deserves a clean introduction because the comment threads tie themselves in knots over his name. He is Colin Armstrong, an SAS corporal who writes under the pen name Chris Ryan. Armstrong confirmed the identity on camera in his own words. His real name is Colin Armstrong, and the pseudonym was adopted to get his side of the story out. The Armstrong versus Ryan discrepancy isn't a mystery, it's a byline. The contradictions are the real problem. On the mission itself, Ryan's account says the task was to gather intelligence, find a lying-up position, establish an observation post, and monitor the main supply route, especially Scud movement. McNab's account says the task was to find and destroy Scud launchers along a 250-kilometre stretch of the road. Those are different missions, with different risk profiles and different definitions of success. On the scale of the fighting, McNab's book implies enemy losses numbering in the hundreds. One commonly cited figure is 250. Asher concluded the patrol accounted for essentially no enemy casualties. Ratcliffe, who sat through the regimental debriefs, said the men never mentioned large-scale contacts with enemy forces or the extraordinary incidents that later filled the books. Both men arrived at the same place independently. What the patrol reported at the time didn't match what the books later claimed. The deaths are one area where the accounts hold steady, and the 2 hypothermia deaths carry their own indictment. Men equipped for a desert observation mission in a western Iraq winter, without proper cold-weather coats, freezing to death while trying to walk out. The fallout after the war was as bitter as the patrol. The publication of the 2 memoirs broke the regiment's code of silence, and the Ministry of Defence responded. Confidentiality agreements were introduced, binding serving and future Special Forces personnel to lifelong secrecy under civil law. Those who refused to sign faced return to their original units. McNab and Ryan were banned from Stirling Lines, the SAS base in Hereford. Coburn published his version as Soldier 5 in 2004. Asher's conclusion is the cleanest statement of the systemic case. The patrol failed because of inadequate planning, a flawed communications architecture, a heavy and impractical loadout, and doctrinal issues, not because of one man's incompetence. Ratcliffe's conclusion from inside the regiment points the other way on the commander's duty of care. And Asher's own investigation isn't beyond challenge. His Iraqi witnesses were interviewed years after the event, and defenders of McNab dismiss him as having been fed a story by Saddam's retained minders. No declassified official record exists that could settle which version is true. The Ministry of Defence has never released an after-action report. No formal public inquiry was ever held. That absence is itself a fact. The most famous patrol in modern SAS history has no official autopsy. What survives is a set of competing memoirs, one investigator's reconstruction, and a comments section doing the work the ministry declined to do. Badly, because the comments section has only 2 categories: heroes and villains. And that is where the selection defence comes in, because it needs exactly the same scrutiny as the accusation. The defence says an incompetent soldier wouldn't pass SAS selection, and the army wouldn't appoint one to command a patrol. The premise is true as far as it goes. McNab failed his first attempt at selection, passed in 1984, and served 9 or 10 years with 22 SAS across 5 continents. For the Bravo 20 mission, he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Ryan, Lane, Concilio and Coburn received the military medal. At one point, he was described as the British Army's most highly decorated serving soldier. But selection is a test of baseline competence under controlled conditions. Endurance, navigation, determination, the will to keep moving when the body wants to stop. It does not certify perfect tactical judgment in a novel environment, under a broken communications architecture carrying an absurd load into bad intelligence. The argument that passing selection clears McNab of every specific decision is the mirror image of the argument that the outcome condemns every decision he made. Neither is evidence. Both are shortcuts past the record. And the record contains decisions that can be examined on their own terms. Proceeding on foot, criticised by the theatre commander himself. The responsibility for communications readiness, asserted by the regiment's RSM. The abort and march to the pick-up point, a reasonable decision made under a plan that was itself broken. These aren't the actions of a cartoon incompetent, and they aren't the flawless moves of a certified Superman. They are the choices of a sergeant inside a system that failed him in at least as many places as he failed it. So, run the scorecard, decision by decision, and see where the blame actually lands. The decision to proceed on foot. This is the strongest individual criticism, and it comes from the top. Brigadier Massey called it an error, and he made clear it was the patrol's own choice. Set against that, the most popular excuse, that suitable vehicles didn't exist, collapses on contact with the record. Bravo 30 took Land Rovers on the same aircraft. The short wheelbase only story is, at best, a local allocation issue, and at worst, a rationalisation after the fact. On the scorecard, this column reads, primarily the patrol's decision, with McNab as commander carrying the largest share, but the full weight of it depends on whether the system gave him a real choice, and that evidence isn't public. The communications failure. The columns divide here. McNab's wrong frequency claim is contradicted by the logged transmissions at headquarters. Ratcliffe's argument that the commander owns the radio check is the strongest single point against McNab in the entire record. But the failure was layered. A radio that needed a static antenna, one-way beacons, a doctrine that treated silence as routine, and an exfiltration plan riding on one ill pilot. This column reads, shared, with the heaviest load on the system that designed the plan. The flawed plan and intelligence. The single helicopter extraction, the assumption that silence meant safety, the drop into a concentration of Iraqi forces, the missing cold weather kit. None of that was McNab's to fix. He was handed a broken plan and ordered to walk into it. This column reads, the system. The fog of war. A bulldozer driver, a goat herder, the January cold, a pilot's illness. The fog of war carries no rank, and it killed or captured as many men as any commander's mistake did. So the accusation with its 65 engagements and the defence with its 18 replies both miss the same target. The accusation that Ryan's book pretty much showed McNab's incompetence is a conclusion without a mechanism. The defence that selection proves competence is a credential without a causal link. The evidence between them distributes responsibility across a man, a system, and a war. McNab made the choice to go without vehicles, and the theatre commander called it an error. The radios were his to check, and the regiment's RSM said so. But the plan he was given was built to fail. The intelligence was wrong, the exfiltration had no redundancy, and the only fully documented explanation for the worst hours, the hypothermia deaths, is the kit he was issued, not the man wearing it. Which leaves the question the comment sections never ask. What would you need to see to abandon your first verdict?
To convict McNab alone, you would need documentation that he personally rejected available long-wheelbase vehicles against senior advice, or that he chose incorrect frequencies against procedure. To clear the system entirely, you would need proof that he had no authority to request vehicles or change communications arrangements. Neither body of evidence exists in the public record. Both verdicts currently require faith. The most engaged comment on the video has 214 engagements and no documentation behind it. The accusation has 65 engagements and no mechanism behind it. The defense has 18 replies and no causation behind it. The patrol itself had 8 men, 3 graves, and 1 long walk to Syria. And the least useful thing anyone can do with that story is decide in advance who was to blame, then go looking for proof.